Okay, so my talk tonight's going to be a little bit about twins, so I thought I'd talk about some facts, myths and misconceptions. And you'll find there's 3 pages. The first is a little question and answer sheet, so if you've had a chance to do that, answer your truths and falses. You can mark your own, don't worry, you don't have to pass it around and mark others. Then the next page is the answers with a little bit of detail, and on the 3rd page I've got some information that I'll give out to my patients in the public clinic and the private about how to work out zygosity and chorionicity in twins, and you may well get asked that by your friends and family. So I'll give you just a minute or two just to do that question and answer if you'd like to. And then I'll just run through each of them and we'll do a little bit of detail on them. Don't spend a lot of time because I'm going to go through them in a bit of detail. So, the first question is whether or not 2 placentas indicates fraternal twins. So we, just on comment on fraternal, identical, monozygotic, dizygotic, we spent some time, we went out to the twin communities, to twins, their parents, their families, and as a lot of twin researchers, we asked what they wanted to call their twins. So we thought that monozygotic and dizygotic was probably the new way of talking about them. But overwhelmingly, they wanted to be known as fraternal and identical twins. That's well over 90% of each group wanted to keep those names. So I will talk about fraternal and identical twins because that's what they want to be known as. So it's a common misconception that if there's 2 separate placentas, that the twins have to be dizygotic, and it's not true. Just under 10% of all dichorionic twins will be monozygotic, and that's because there's an early split of that egg. So if that egg splits early, before about day 3, you'll end up with an identical twin pregnancy but 2 separate placentas. And when we sampled obstetricians, we found about 30% of them get that wrong as well. So it's a big misconception in the community. So 2 placentas, that certainly does not mean that they're fraternal. It's important to know that because if you know that twins are identical, then they are a perfect match for each other, perhaps for organ donation, which is rare, but no, if one twin can donate a kidney to the other without any need for immunosuppression at all. But more important are the common things that, because they're genetically virtually identical, they'll share diseases. So if you have one twin that has perhaps a bowel cancer, then you know you've got to go looking in the co-twin. There's a very high chance that co-twin will get the same cancer. If one twin has diabetes, type 2 diabetes, there's a very high chance the co-twin will get type 2 diabetes as well. So then that's your opportunity for early intervention in that group. You can step in early and stop that. So it is important to know it, not just for their own sense of identity as well. If you look on that 3rd page with the colour, I just want to take you through the 2nd paragraph there because there's some pretty simple rules to work out whether twins are identical or not. They're pretty close to rigid, but not quite. The first thing is if you have opposite sex twins, they are dizygotic, they're fraternal. A very, very common question I was asked in my twins clinic, the mums would come back with the twins in the pram, there'd be a boy and the girl, and they'd ask me, are they identical? Seriously. It blew me away, but it was the commonest question. I was asked that more often than anything else, and I had to learn to keep a straight face. But yes, if they're opposite sex, they're fraternal, definitely. A golden rule has always been that if twins share a placenta, they're identical. So the monochorionic twins are identical. You'll see my question 2, that's not quite the case. There are some rare exceptions, but generally, 1 placenta, identical twins. But if you have 2 placentas and same-sex twins, they can be either identical or fraternal, so they need a zygosity test. So the simplest way to do that is through like Twins Research Australia, who I work with, or anywhere online, but Twins Research Australia has a link on their website. It costs about $100 to do a zygosity test. They get sent a kit in the mail, they do a cheek swab from each baby, put it in an envelope, send it away, and they'll find out a few weeks later. It's incredibly accurate, like 1 in 50 billion chance they're wrong. Pretty simple. And about $100 for a pair. So that's not the same as doing like paternity testing where you've got to clean the lab out and take verified samples and everything. But that's about $5,000. But these are simple cheek swabs, about $100. So pretty simple test to do. Having said that rule, as I said, that single placenta means they're identical. We found that about 1 in 70 of those twins that share a placenta will not be identical. And that might be relevant in your practices. If you see a patient who's told their twins have to be identical because there's one placenta, and they come in and look really different, they might be that 1 in 70 that are dizygotic. So you can have, thank you very much, dizygotic but monochorionic twins. Very, very rare, but it's very distressing for mothers particularly to be told that you're absolutely wrong. They have to be identical. And they're looking at these babies day in and day out and they look different. So just have an awareness that can sometimes happen. If you're not sure about it, give me a call. I do that stuff on the phone all the time. I can sort that out for parents. And sometimes with triplets, they're trying to work out if they're identical or not. Again, I'll do that all the time. Just give me a call and that's fine. Sorry, do you mind if I have a spoon? Oh, thank you. Thanks. So I don't want to get bogged down on that because it's pretty rare, but just occasionally, thank you, that in your practice you might see someone who's been told that your babies are definitely identical and you have a look at them and you think, no, they're not. So just call me. I can sort it out pretty easily. So the next two topics I want to talk about are when and how twins should be delivered. And you might notice in your practices that if you're having any sets of twins, they're being delivered a lot earlier these days. And there's certainly the golden rule now is that all twins should be delivered by 37 weeks at the latest. If they're identical twins, so they share a placenta, that should probably be by 36 weeks at the latest. And for the very rare sets of twins where they share a single amniotic sac, the monoamniotic twins, they should be delivered by 32 weeks. So they're an exceptional group that are very, very rare, but generally all twins out by 37 weeks at the latest, and if they share a placenta, probably by 36 weeks. Because there's risks of late fetal death in those for various reasons that I've got listed there. The next thing is how they should be delivered. And there's this perception that caesarean section is the safest option to deliver twins, and certainly in the last decade the rate of caesarean section for twins has gone up to be really quite high. If you meet all the criteria of the randomised trial that's there, that means that the first twin has to be head first, they both have to be between 1,500 and 4,000 grams, it's got to be in a hospital where you've got access to theatres, and you've got to have an obstetrician who can do vaginal twin deliveries, then it's just as safe to do a vaginal twin delivery as a caesarean section. Now, not every hospital has immediate access to an operating theatre. They don't have obstetricians who do vaginal twin deliveries. So what might be okay at the women's hospital where we can do all those things may not necessarily be the case in a small private hospital where you don't have all those facilities. So when those criteria are met, it's completely okay to have a vaginal twin delivery. Having said that, the majority of patients who come through my practice prefer delivery by caesarean section. They ask for it, they expect it, that's the sort of... And we have the discussion, some of them will change their mind, many of them won't. So, in your practices you might see, you all know about NIPT testing I presume, whether that's Panorama or Percept or Harmony. When they were first introduced there was no option for NIPT testing in twins. There is now, but you just need to be aware of a few little caveats for it. The first is that you need that the overall fetal fraction in twins is higher, but the individual fetal fraction is lower. So just with the fetal fraction, when they're measuring for NIPS, you're looking at circulating DNA. Some of that's maternal, some of it's fetal. It's actually not fetal, it's placental DNA, but we'll call it fetal. You need at least 2.5% fetal fraction. If you've got a Percept test, you need at least 4% for a Harmony test. So with twins, because you get an individual fetal fraction is a little bit lower, you want to wait a little bit longer to do the NIPS test. So I do my singles at 10 weeks, but I do my twins at 11. So just time to get that more fetal fraction and get that differentiation between them. You can partially determine sex on twins from NIPS testing. because they'll report the presence or absence of a Y chromosome. So if there's a Y chromosome, if there's absent Y chromosome, obviously 2 girls. If there's a Y chromosome, it might be 2 boys or 1 boy, 1 girl. So it's worth just flagging that with patients first. A catch with NIPT testing is if you've had a miscarriage of one of the twins. So it's not uncommon to have twins where one of them will miscarry between 6 and 12 weeks. We know about a quarter of twins at 6 weeks will only be a single pregnancy at 12 weeks. So the catch is that if there's a miscarriage between 6 and 12 weeks, it's highly likely that was related to aneuploidy, and that's the reason for the miscarriage. So if you do a NIPT test and you get an aneuploid result, it's likely that it's come from the miscarried fetus, but it could have still come from the surviving fetus. So the first thing to do is pre-warn people before you do NIPT testing with a Vanishing that there might be an abnormal result. That doesn't mean the baby, your surviving baby, is a problem. But what you've got to do if you do get an aneuploid result is repeat it 3 weeks later. So if the miscarriage was aneuploid, the abnormal fetal fraction will be dropping. But if the surviving twin is aneuploid, then the aneuploid fetal fraction will be going up. I know Percept will do the second test for free. So if the first one comes back aneuploid, they pay their $450 for the first test. They don't have to pay any more for the second test. So first one at 11 weeks. If it's aneuploid, do another one at about 14 weeks. I know you're getting on a fair way into the pregnancy, but there's no other way of doing it unless you want to do a CVS test early on. So, but that's the way. So you can still do it, and you'll often see the NIPS people will say, oh, if there's a miscarriage of a twin, you can't do the test. You can, but you just need to interpret it carefully. Again, if you're not sure, very happy if you give me a call. My business card's out there. I don't mind being rung at all. Leading on from that, if you do lose a twin in the first trimester, so you only have a single continuing pregnancy, it's called a vanishing twin. It's a terrible word. We're asking the twin community what they'd like to call that, but at the moment we're still calling them vanishing twins. So you have initially twins, but only one continuing. It's not a benign condition. It used to be thought that it was completely harmless. You've lost a twin, that was very sad, but no, the rest of the pregnancy will be okay. It's not necessarily the case. If it happens really early, like at 6 weeks, it's probably okay. But the further you go along a pregnancy, so you get into 11, 12, 13 weeks, there's a higher chance of early delivery, growth restriction, premature labour, preeclampsia, all more common if there's a late loss of a twin. So they become a group that's flagged as high risk. They need to be watched pretty carefully. So the next one I wanted to talk about was that myth that dizygotic twins skip a generation. I'm sure everyone's heard of that. It's absolute rubbish. Dizygotic twinning is inherited down the maternal line. There are a lot of factors that affect the rates of dizygotic twinning. It certainly runs in families. If someone has had dizygotic twins themselves, they've got about a 1 in 20 chance of having their next pregnancy being dizygotic twins again. So 1 in 80 chance normally, that goes to 1 in 20 if they've had dizygotic twins. If their mother or sisters had dizygotic twins, it's about 1 in 40. So double if you've got a mother or sibling with it, or sister with it, and quadrupled if you've had them yourself. Dizygotic twin also changes by race, by age, by height. So tall women have more dizygotic twins. Women of 35 to 39 are the particularly high risk group. They have the highest rate of dizygotic twinning. Into early 40s, again, high rates of dizygotic twinning, probably because they're getting a little bit of ovarian resistance. The FSH levels are just being pushed up a bit, and all of a sudden high FSH levels and you fire off 2 follicles. But race is particularly important. We know in Australia it's about 1 in 80 overall. Japanese women have the lowest rate of twinning in the world, 1 in 150. East African women have the highest rate in the world, about 1 in 20. So very, very common. Sudanese, Ethiopian women, very high rates of twinning. And so you often see those, they have large families. There's often multiple sets of twins in those families. I offer my women who've had dizygotic twins before, they're often happy to have had 1 set of twins, but they don't want a second set of twins. So I offer them follicle scanning. So they go along about day 12, have a vaginal ultrasound, look at how many follicles are developing. If there's only one follicle, they do try to conceive, but if there's two or more, then they don't try to conceive in that cycle. So that reduces their rate of recurrent twinning. It's very different from monozygotic twinning. The rate of monozygotic twinning is not influenced by anything. It doesn't run in families. It's not related to age, to race, to height. It's 1 in 250 pregnancies will be monozygotic. That's every country, every race, every height, every age. It doesn't change. With the exception of unbelievably rare families where it runs in families, but they're so rare it's of interest to twin researchers like me, but it's really, really rare. So monozygotic twins, if they've had monozygotic twins, they've got a 1 in 80 chance of twins the next time. It doesn't increase at all. I've got two more topics. One is to talk about monozygotic twins. We always talk about them being identical, and they want to be known as identical, but they are different. You can tell them apart. Their mothers can tell them apart really early, their fathers shortly afterwards. Their friends can tell them apart. They look really, really similar, but they are slightly different. They do have different fingerprints. I'm often asked, do they have the same fingerprints? They have very, very similar fingerprints, but they are different. So in the past, there's been cases where one twin's trying to blame the other twin, saying they committed the crime, and then they blame each other, and so you can't theoretically convict one of them. But their fingerprints are different. You can actually pick the difference. And their DNA is different. Ever so slightly, it can be. So they've started off with identical DNA. They've come from the single zygote, but they have different DNA. Even at the moment of birth, their DNA is slightly different. We've done some beautiful research at the Women's where we've looked at their DNA at the time of delivery, and we've found that they're different. It's on the epigenetic markers. So the epigenetics their markers are slightly different at birth, which is fascinating because when you think they've come from the same egg, the same uterus, the same placenta, the same mother, yet they're epigenetically slightly different at birth. So there's something in utero that's changing that, which is exciting things when you're thinking about it, because you can then change the epigenetics of a child's DNA before they're born. So, and whether that's with folic acid or nutrition or not smoking or anything, you can interrupt or you can change their DNA expression before they're born. So that's where the fascination is with that sort of work. And that's a whole different thing we won't go off there. The last thing I want to talk about was, I only found this out a month ago, and this blew me away, and it's absolutely rock solid, that if you take a pair of monozygotic identical twins and you separate them at birth, and you raise them separately for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and you measure their personality 50 years after they've been separated, they're identical. Absolutely identical. It blew me away, because you'd think that you have identical twins, one's raised in a deprived environment, one in a culturally rich environment. Their personalities are absolutely identical. And that research is rock solid. It's done by a lady called Nancy Siegel, that's her area of interest. And it's blown everyone away when they saw it. But I think it's fascinating. So all that nature-nurture argument, when it comes to personality, it's all nature. Your environment does not influence your personality. It influences lots of other things, behaviour and things, but not your personality. It's amazing, isn't it? So I hope that leaves us a few minutes just for you to ask me any questions that you like. Doesn't have to be just on twins, but on pregnancies in general. And you've got my cards here, so you're welcome to ask me any questions you like. You're welcome to ring me at any time. I'm quite contactable.
What do you mean when you skip generation? What do you mean skipping generation?
It used to be thought that if a woman had twins, then her daughter wouldn't, but her granddaughter would have twins. And there's a bit of a myth. There's a big myth in the community that's the case. Just not true. So. So this is the sort of first time we've done it this way, so we've come up with a couple of ideas, and we thought we'd get some feedback from you as to what sort of format you like. But feel free to ask me any questions. So.
The incidence of guys that got twins quite high in Papua New Guinea and Tonga?
It's about, that's in the mid-range, so it's probably in the one, it's still in the 1 in 80 sort of range. It's in that. I'm trying to think. Yep. So Pacific Island definitely in the 1 in 80 range. So yep. But it's fascinating if you take. Well, Hawaii. If you look at Hawaii with a mixture of Japanese and American population, the overall risk, if you're an American living in Hawaii, your risk of having twins is 1 in 80. If you're a Japanese woman living in Japan, your risk of having twins is 1 in 150. But if you move from Japan to Hawaii, it's about 1 in 100. It changes. It goes down towards the 1 in 80. So there's something in the environment that's influencing the rate of twinning, not just your genetics. So that's where the complexity arises. So it's not just your racial background, it's where you live. It does influence. And if you're an American and you go and live in Japan, your rate of twinning goes more towards the 1 in 100 mark than the 1 in 80. There must be some significant environmental factors in it as well. So we're seeing that with the East African women who are in Australia, that it was 1 in 20 in East Africa, but it's much lower when they come to Australia. The longer they're in Australia, the closer their rate approximates Australians as well. Never gets there, but it gets closer to it. It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. It's also seasonal. Twins are more common when they're conceived in spring as well. No idea why. No idea. There are. About 5% of triplets that will be monozygotic. They're very rare and they're very, very complicated. They deliver often very early. They have high rates of triplet transfusion. They're really, really complicated. Monozygotic quadruplets is incredibly rare, about 1 in 500,000 pregnancies. But they can happen, but they're really, really rare. So I've not seen a set. I've seen plenty of monozygotic triplets, but I've not seen any monozygotic quadruplets. They can happen, but they're rare.
With IVF, you get higher percentage of twins delivery. How high?
With IVF, it depends how many embryos they put back. So, if you go back 10 years, when they were often putting back 2 or 3 embryos. About 25% of all twins in Australia came from IVF, and only 4% of all conceptions came from IVF. Now, it's still 4% of all conceptions come from IVF, but the rate of twinning is down to about 10%. That's because they're putting back single embryos over 90% of the time. So very responsible. However, when they put back a single embryo, there's an increased chance that will split early, and we see quite a lot of our monochorionic twins, our monos, come out of a single embryo transfer. And it's because they're doing the transfers on day 5 now rather than day 2, and it's probable that the zona pellucida gets a little bit more fragile around that day 5 mark and it splits a bit more easily. So most of our complicated twins now come from day 5 single embryo transfers when you end up with identical twins.
What about chlamydia use?
Don't start me on that. So we know that it depends whether you monitor it with ultrasound or not, but the risk of twins with clomiphene is somewhere between 5 and 8%. So if you now say the risk of twins with IVF and single embryo transfer is 2%, and with clomid it's about 8%, and with gonadotrophin injections it's 25%, it's a very strong argument for not doing ovulation induction at all and just going straight to IVF with single embryo transfer, because you're not going to get that rate of twins or triplets. However, IVF's a lot more expensive, it's a lot more involved, and it's a bit of a balance. But when my patients have clomiphene, I make sure that they have ultrasound monitoring. So they go along, they have clomiphene early, they go on day 12 and have a scan. They can only conceive if they've got 1 follicle. And that takes the twinning rate down to nothing, effectively nothing. So,
there's a lot of obstetricians who prescribe clomiphene.
There are a lot of obstetricians, and it's good for me when I look after twins and triplets. It's good for my business, but it's not good for the women. I think that's just wrong. I think that we know people say, they're only twins. They forget that if you have a set of twins, there's a 5% chance that your twins will be born before 28 weeks. 1 in 20 will be born for 28 weeks. If you've got triplets, there's a 15% chance that they'll be all born before 28 weeks. You don't want to have your babies born before 28 weeks. So they get more preeclampsia, more gestational diabetes, more prematurity, all those consequences. I think it's irresponsible to prescribe clomiphene without monitoring follicles. Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
I didn't realise I would have to give you mine.
No, it's not your fault.
Oh. So, yeah, I don't think it's right to prescribe clomiphene without monitoring. And I tell my patients, you might want to go along on day 12 and have a vaginal scan every month, but I'm sure you'd rather do that than bring up raised twins. And when you put it to them like that, they're normally pretty...
Some of my patients wrote from it from overseas.
Overseas is a big issue. So my almost all my quadruplets and higher come from overseas now. And I'm seeing quintuplets, sextuplets coming from IVF and ovulation induction from overseas.